Early October 1942, U.S. Army Air Force Hospital, East Anglia, England. Colonel Malcolm Grow bent over the operating table, extracting another jagged piece of metal from the chest of a 22-year-old tail gunner. The fragment, no larger than a fingernail, had missed the boy's heart by 2 inches. As he placed the bloodied shrapnel into a metal tray, Grow counted silently. 17 pieces from this one airman. 17 pieces that had punched through the aluminum skin of a B-17 flying fortress, through a sheepskin-lined flight jacket, and into human flesh. The boy would live, but Staff Sergeant James Morrison from Iowa would never fly again. Through the surgery room windows, Grow could hear the distant rumble of Wright Cyclone engines as another formation of bombers returned from Bremen. More casualties were coming. They always were. What Grow documented that evening in his office would trigger the most controversial innovation in American military aviation, a development that would save more aircrew lives than any other single advancement of the air war, yet would face resistance from the very men whose lives it would preserve. The mathematics were undeniable. In his detailed report, compiled from examining wounded airmen over the previous months, Grow discovered that 70% of wounds came not from enemy fighter cannon shells or machine gun bullets, but from relatively low-velocity missiles, fragments of German anti-aircraft shells that exploded around the bombers at 25,000 feet, pieces of aircraft structure shattered by explosions, shards of plexiglass from destroyed gun turrets. These fragments travelled at velocities low enough that light armour could stop them. The solution seemed obvious to a surgeon who had spent months pulling metal from young bodies. If these men wore protective armour, most would never reach his operating table. The resistance came immediately. October 12, 1942, Headquarters 8th Air Force, Bushy Park, London. Grow stood before a room of sceptical combat officers, his proposal for body armour spread across the conference table. Colonel Curtis LeMay, commanding the 305th Bombardment Group, was the first to speak. "You're asking my boys to wear 20 pounds of steel plates while trying to fight off Fokker wolves. They can barely move in their current gear at 20 below zero." The room murmured agreement. These were men who had learned their trade when aircraft were made of fabric and wood, when mobility meant survival, when the only protection a pilot had was his skill and his speed. Major Robert Travis of the 41st Bombardment Squadron added his voice. "The weight alone will affect our fuel consumption. Every pound matters when we're pushing the range to hit targets in Germany. And what happens when they have to bail out? You're asking them to jump with an anchor strapped to their chest." But Grow had anticipated every objection. He had already designed a prototype with quick-release mechanisms, cords that when pulled would instantly jettison the armour. He had calculated the fuel consumption difference, less than 1% on a typical mission. Most importantly, he had the statistics. At the current casualty rate, the 8th Air Force would run out of trained crews before spring. The mathematics of attrition were brutal and undeniable. Without protection, the daylight bombing campaign would collapse not from lack of aircraft, but from lack of men to fly them. Lieutenant Colonel Bayon Lay Jr., who would later fly the famous Regensburg mission, captured the prevailing sentiment in his diary, "Armour is for knights and tanks, not airmen. We are the cavalry of the air. Our protection is our guns and our courage." December 1942, Kimballton Airfield, home of the 379th Bombardment Group. Grow had convinced a single crew to test his prototype armour vests on a mission to Lille. He chose them carefully, the crew of Yankee Doodle, led by Captain John Miller, a former engineer from Detroit who understood machinery and mathematics. Miller's crew had completed 8 missions, enough to be veterans, not enough to be superstitious. The vests Grow provided were crude by later standards, canvas coverings with overlapping squares of manganese steel, each piece 2 inches square and 1 millimeter thick, sewn into pockets that allowed flexibility. The entire apparatus weighed 22 pounds and covered the chest and back. Miller's gunners wore them under sceptical glares from other crews. The mission to Lille on December 6, 1942, changed everything. Flak over the target was moderate by German standards, but accurate. Yankee Doodle took 17 hits from shell fragments. When Miller's crew returned, they discovered that 12 of those fragments had struck crew members wearing the vests. Not one had penetrated. Sergeant Anthony Rousseau, the ball turret gunner, pulled 7 pieces of German shrapnel from the front of his vest, each one deformed from impact, each one that would have been in his chest. Word spread through the 379th like wildfire. Within days, crews were asking when more vests would be available. Grow faced a production problem. The British Wilkinson Sword Company, famous for their ceremonial blades, had been contracted to manufacture body armour for the RAF based on similar principles, but RAF Bomber Command had rejected them. The vests were too bulky for the cramped confines of Lancaster bombers, and British doctrine emphasised night bombing where fighter attacks were less common. Through diplomatic channels, Grow began negotiations to acquire the British stock while simultaneously pushing for American production. March 1943 marked the turning point. Grow delivered a dozen prototype suits for testing in actual combat situations. The results were immediate and undeniable. Crews wearing the armour suffered dramatically fewer casualties from flak. The Wilkinson Sword Company began mass production for both British and American forces, though the RAF remained reluctant users. The vests were officially designated M1 Flyers vests, though crews simply called them flak jackets. May 1943, Thorpe Abbotts, home of the Bloody 100th Bombardment Group. The 100th had earned its nickname through appalling losses, sometimes losing entire squadrons in a single mission. Technical Sergeant George Bradley, a radio operator with the 349th Squadron, recalled, "We thought wearing armour meant you were scared. Nobody wanted to be seen as yellow. But when we saw guys coming back alive who should have been dead, that changed everything." At Ridgewell, home of the 381st Bombardment Group, the squadron commander posted a simple chart in the briefing room showing casualties with and without armour. The ratio was nearly 3-1. No speeches were necessary. Within a week, every available vest was in use. July 8, 1943, Washington, D.C. Colonel Malcolm Grow stood at attention as General Henry Hap Arnold pinned the Legion of Merit to his uniform. The citation read, "For exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding services." Colonel Grow's development of body armour for aircrew members has resulted in a marked reduction in casualties and has materially contributed to the maintenance of combat crew morale. The statistics Arnold had on his desk showed casualty rates from flak and fragments had dropped by 60% among protected crew members. That evening, Grow received a telegram from Staff Sergeant James Morrison, the Iowa tail gunner from whose chest Grow had removed 17 fragments 9 months earlier. Morrison had learned of Grow's decoration from Stars and Stripes. His message read, "Thank you for not giving up on us." Production scaled rapidly through summer 1943. The UK supplied the USAAF with 9,600 flak jackets under Lend-Lease arrangements. American production began at multiple facilities, with the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Armour Workshop becoming the main design research laboratory. Their medieval armour experts understood the principles of overlapping plates and weight distribution better than military contractors. By October 5, 1943, the M1 Flyers vest was officially adopted as standard equipment. August 17, 1943, the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission. The 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers, with 552 airmen killed or missing. Analysis showed that crew members wearing full armour suits suffered 70% fewer fatal wounds from flak than those without protection. Captain Robert Morgan, pilot of the famous Memphis Belle, toured training bases after completing his 25 missions, telling replacement crews, "I wish we'd had armour from our first mission. Don't count on luck. Wear every piece of protection they give you." October 1943 brought Black Week, culminating in Black Thursday on October 14th, when 77 bombers were lost attacking Schweinfurt. Among the survivors, those wearing body armour reported a psychological effect. Technical Sergeant William Alexander, a top turret gunner with the 94th Bombardment Group, described it, "When flak started bursting around us, I could feel fragments hitting my vest. Each hit that didn't get through made me feel stronger, not weaker." By November 1943, every combat crew member in the 8th Air Force had access to body armour. The designs had evolved through combat testing. The M2 vest for pilots who sat in armoured seats needed protection only in front. The M3 apron protected the lower abdomen and groin. The M4 vest incorporated better weight distribution and enhanced coverage. December 1943 saw the arrival of the M3 Flak helmet in the European theatre, the first of 3 versions developed during the war. The complete ensemble now weighed nearly 30 pounds, but crews considered it as essential as their parachutes. A captured Luftwaffe pilot, Oberleutnant Heinrich Müller of Jagdgeschwader 26, told interrogators, "Your gunners have become harder to kill. We noticed in autumn that our attacks were less effective. Men we should have killed kept fighting. It was demoralizing." January 1944 brought systematic analysis revealing that body armor reduced fatalities from thoracic wounds by 77.1% and abdominal wounds by 82.8%. Replacement crews arriving in England had trained with body armor from the beginning. What had been seen as cowardice 18 months earlier was now standard procedure. February 20th, 1944, during Big Week, First Lieutenant William R. Lawley Jr.'s B-17, cabin in the sky, was attacked by 20 German fighters. A 20mm cannon shell exploded in the cockpit, killing the co-pilot instantly. Lawley, severely wounded in the face, was wearing one of Grove's vests. The fragments that struck his chest and abdomen were stopped by the manganese steel plates. Despite his wounds and with blood obscuring his vision, Lawley flew his crippled bomber back to England after learning 2 crew members were too wounded to bail out. He would receive the Medal of Honor, becoming another testament to the effectiveness of body armor in enabling heroic action even when wounded. The 6 days of Big Week saw the 8th Air Force fly 3,300 bomber sorties, losing 226 bombers but establishing air superiority before D-Day. Despite the intensity of combat, the fatality rate from flak and fragments was 40% lower than comparable missions a year earlier. Post-mission analysis showed the average bomber had taken 12 hits from flak fragments. Without armor, each bomber would have averaged 2 wounded crew members. With armor, the average was less than 1. Spring 1944 brought continued innovation. The M5 helmet provided head and neck protection while allowing use of oxygen masks. The M6 vest incorporated aluminum plates in non-critical areas, reducing weight by 15%. The M7 added ceramic inserts capable of stopping larger fragments. Each improvement came from combat experience and analysis of wounds that armor hadn't prevented. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, body armor had become so integrated into American bomber operations that its absence would have seemed strange. The 8th Air Force flew 254,887 bomber sorties in 1944, losing 2,439 aircraft. Yet the casualty rate per sortie was less than half that of 1943. Medical analysis consistently showed body armor responsible for a 30 to 40% reduction in fatal casualties. The influence extended internationally. The Royal Air Force began issuing modified versions to Lancaster crews in late 1943. The Soviet Air Force received 50,000 American armor vests through Lend-Lease. Even the Luftwaffe, through captured examples, began issuing armor to fighter pilots, though German production never matched American volumes. March 1945, as the war in Europe entered its final months, Brigadier General Malcolm Grow visited bomber bases across England. At Grafton Underwood, home of the 384th Bombardment Group, he met Technical Sergeant Robert Williams, a tail gunner from Ohio. Williams showed him his vest, peppered with dents and tears from fragment impacts. From his pocket, he produced 14 deformed pieces of German steel, each stopped by the vest. "I've been collecting them, sir," Williams said. "Figured my kids might want to see what you did for us." May 1945 brought final statistics. American factories had produced 338,780 M1 and M2 vests, 95,919 M3 aprons, and 250,000 various helmet models. The program cost $48 million, roughly the price of 160 B-17 bombers. Medical analysis credited body armor with saving approximately 8,000 lives and preventing serious injury to 27,000 more among American aircrew. Veterans returned home with stories of survival that would have been impossible without armor. Staff Sergeant Anthony Russo, who had worn one of the first vests on that December 1942 mission to Lille, kept one of the fragments that his vest had stopped. When asked why, he said, "To remember that someone cared enough to protect us." In 1949, Malcolm Grow became the first Surgeon General of the newly independent United States Air Force. In his acceptance speech, he reflected, "The greatest privilege of my career was not the rank or recognition, but the opportunity to develop equipment that brought young men home to their families. Every life saved justified every hour of research, every bureaucratic battle, every moment of doubt." October 20th, 1960. Malcolm Grow died at Walter Reed Army Hospital. His funeral at Arlington National Cemetery was attended by hundreds of veterans. Among the honorary pallbearers was James Morrison, the Iowa tail gunner from whom Grow had removed those 17 fragments in October 1942. Morrison had survived the war, become a teacher, raised 4 children, and lived the life that would have ended at 22 without Grow's determination. The legacy extended beyond individual lives saved. The concept of protection through technology that Grow pioneered became fundamental to American military thinking. The willingness to invest in soldier protection, even at significant cost, distinguished American forces from adversaries who viewed personnel as expendable. Modern body armor, capable of stopping rifle rounds that would have destroyed any World War II protection, exists because Malcolm Grow proved armor could work and convinced skeptical warriors to wear it. In 1985, at the 40th anniversary reunion of the 8th Air Force in San Antonio, Texas, former Luftwaffe pilots attended as invited guests. Oberstleutnant Wolfgang Fischer, who had flown with Jagdgeschwader II, spoke at the memorial dinner. "We learned to fear your armor. We would make perfect attacks, see our shells strike, and the gunner would keep firing. We called them Iron Men, not knowing they were just boys wearing steel plates." Today, at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, a display case holds one of the original M1 Flak vests next to a modern tactical vest worn in Afghanistan. A placard explains the connection, how military body armor evolved from one doctor's refusal to accept that casualties were inevitable. Malcolm Grow's achievement was not just developing effective armor, but convincing a skeptical military culture to accept it. The pre-war military, small and tradition-bound, gave way to a citizen force that brought civilian pragmatism to military problems. The question, "Why not protect our people?" seemed obvious to factory workers and farmers turned airmen, even as it challenged professional military orthodoxy. The story concludes where it began, with young men facing deadly threats in the air. But by war's end, those threats were mitigated by steel plates and manganese armor, by systematic innovation and industrial production, by one doctor's determination to protect those he was sworn to heal. The principle that Malcolm Grow established, that American forces should be the best protected in the world, remains fundamental to military operations. Every soldier who returns home because armor stopped a bullet or fragment represents the continuation of work begun in an English hospital in October 1942, when a surgeon decided that pulling shrapnel from young bodies was a problem that could be solved rather than a tragedy that must be accepted.